Excellent. Well, thank you, Luann, for putting this all together. Thank you to all of you that are here this evening. It was kind of fun seeing who is the first timers being here at one of our CARES events. So welcome to all of you. Truly grateful to have this chance to have a conversation with you all tonight. Our topic, as you probably are aware because you signed up for, and you can see it kind of on my slide there in front of us, is TBRI, sensory integration and troubleshooting. So if you're not really too familiar with what this whole idea of sensory integration is, no worries. We are going to talk about that a bit as we go along. So there'll be more kind of definitions and breakdown of that. But really, we're going to be focusing on our kids that we serve within our child welfare system and how they might be struggling processing and interpreting their sensory information. So hold that with you for just a moment. And I'm going to ask in just a second for you to share with us, what does sensory challenges look like in your experience? What are things have you seen? What are things that you anticipate? Just to kind of give us a picture of what we're talking about. So anyway, start thinking and scrolling through your brain about that one. But I just wanted to take a quick moment and introduce myself. As Luann mentioned, I'm Sherry Colomb. I have had the very great privilege of supporting Alliance caregiver trainings for many, many years in many, many different contexts. I am a former foster parent. I am an adoptive parent, and I am a TBRI practitioner, which stands for trust-based relational intervention. And really, in the super short Cliff Notes version of what TBRI is a model or an intervention that we use with kids that have experienced trauma, because we've taken all of this wonderful information that we have now about brain development, how the brain develops optimally, and then what that means as far as future life outcomes. We have a huge body of research about that now. The flip side, which is still really interesting but not quite as much fun, is we also have quite a bit of information now about what happens when optimal brain development does not take place for some reason, particularly if that young child has experienced trauma. So what TBRI has done is taken information about how trauma impacts the developing brain. And then with that impact, what does that mean as far as behavior, navigating the world, relating to people? And TBRI has kind of married those two things together and developed a set of strategies to help us know, for those of us interacting with young people, what do we do? How can we be helpful? Based on the brain science that we do know and have available to us. So the big three concepts in TBRI are connection. The brain develops in connection and relationship to caregivers. And when that doesn't happen perfectly, we see some pretty big outcomes as a result of that maybe aren't super positive. So the first TBRI principle is all around relationship and connection. How do we use that to heal brains impacted by trauma? The second TBRI principle is what we call empowerment. And that's maybe takes a little bit more definition, but really what we're talking about is, how does this child navigate the world, and how do they take in information both from out in the environment as well as the information that's happening physiologically within themselves? How do our kids understand and process that? Again, if they've had some, bumpy beginnings, there can be some impacts in those areas. So TBRI developed a set of strategies to help understand how we can support children in those areas. And then the third principle of TBRI, which is really the one that people get excited about, is what we call the correcting principles. And we look at correcting in two different ways. We look at proactive, what can you do to get out in front of a potential behavior challenge? How can you kind of preload those skills so those kids can navigate situations and maybe not have a concerning or escalated behavior? And knowing that that is not always possible, if a behavior takes place that requires some intervention of some sort, how do we do that in a supported, connected, and empowering way? So as we go along today, we're going to be talking about sensory integration, but all of the information and all of the strategies that I have to share with you and the tools and resources to help you along that are all going to be based in those 3 TBRI principles. So I just wanted to kick that off with a little mini crash course, like I said, in what TBRI is. And as caregivers or people interacting with youth here in Washington State, there is a whole suite of TBRI classes available to you if you want more information about trust-based relational intervention. The Alliance Caregiver Training Catalog has an introduction course, as well as standalone courses on each of those 3 principles. I know I'm a little biased as a TBRI practitioner, but I truly feel like for those of us interacting with youth, those of us that are interacting with children that have experienced trauma, that these are some of the foundational, elemental, and most important courses that you can take, in that it's going to really lay a foundation of understanding for you to build kind of your interactions with kids upon. So anyway, shameless plug right there about TBRI. I mentioned, oh, Sabrina and Steve are asking in the chat, will we have access to all this information recorded after the class? It's great so far, thank you. And I'm excited to rewatch it and really absorb it. Yes, I can speak to this because I access these recordings frequently, both for my personal life and for my training world. On the Alliance Cares website, there will be a recording of this special event, as well as many, many, many others. Luann just gave you a sample of what's coming. So you can always go under support groups on the Alliance Cares website, under special events, under recordings, and you can see all sorts of topics that have been trained on in the past. So it's a great little library to have to refer to. As I mentioned, I use it shamelessly all the time. So anyway, great question. All kinds of great questions coming into the chat. Can the birth experience have something to do with sensory integration issues? Absolutely. Basically, every experience can have an impact on how a kid processes sensory information. And a difficult birth experience is one of those risk factors that we do see in this area as many others. So that's a great question. So I mentioned that we're going to be talking about sensory integration. So I thought, what does kids that are having trouble processing sensory info, what does that look like? What have you seen? What have you experienced? If anybody has any thoughts, there's really no right or wrong answers to this at this point, because we're all just getting kicked off with our learning in this area. Or this conversation tonight, drop that in the chat box. I'd love you to see. I have one example on the screen of a kid screaming and holding their ears. That's a kid struggling with one of their senses. So that's why I tried to put that one out there. So if anybody has any ideas, yeah, I've seen this kid get overloaded and this is what it's looked like. Anybody has any ideas about that? Drop that in the chat. Would love to get us going. Tamara, if you scroll back up in our chat box a little bit, she says, touch, hearing, feeling, sensory issues. What does it mean if children haven't had trauma and are sensitive to touch? Great pieces of information there. So lots of sensitivities can come out of early trauma. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in just a couple minutes. But one of the things that we definitely do want to make sure people know is that just because a kid is struggling with processing sensory information does not necessarily mean it is related to trauma. Can kids that have had a healthy birth experience, great prenatal care, Loving and attuned caregivers, not experienced abuse or neglect. Can those kids still have challenges with sensory processing issues? Yes, absolutely they can. It's probably just going to stem from a different cause. There's different reasons why kids can have sensory sensitivities. We're going to be talking today about those that spring out of early childhood trauma. And can we just be honest? Like, we're going to talk more about senses, what I mean by that in just a moment, because we all have quite a bit of base knowledge around that. But if we were sitting around and able to do this class, you know, like sitting around a table, drinking coffee and eating some snacks, we could have a chance to talk about, like, you know, even as an adult, I struggle with this or I struggle with that. When the environment is too loud or bright, with the fluorescent lights they have in Walmart when I go shopping, like, everybody has a sensory world they're navigating, and all of us are going to have different sensitivities to that. How we handle those is kind of really where our conversation is going to be a little bit focused today. So all of us are going to be uncomfortable handling sensory information at times, and that is completely normal. The difference is we have the ability to navigate that perhaps more successfully than some of the kids that we perhaps work with, or perhaps not. I'm making some assumptions about us as adults. Sometimes I don't think I navigate my sensory information perfectly. So anyway, and I'm just appreciating everybody popping in the chat box. As Luann mentioned, we're going to have a time to kind of chat and answer questions and just talk about things a little bit later on. But please know that the chat box is always open to you. I'll try to keep an eye on it and get back to any of the things posting. And if I don't, Luann's going to help me circle back and make sure we capture those at the end of our time today. Thomas is asking the question, I'm curious if a child being considered a sensory seeker would also fall under this umbrella. Yes, yes, it does. And we are going to talk about that as we go along. So thanks. You're right on track with that. So when a kid is struggling, perhaps processing sensory information, sensory seeking is one way it can show up. So we'll talk about what that means. Is there an easy way to find all of the TBRI training available through the Alliance website? That is such a great question, Rodney. I've worked for the Alliance a long time. I'm very familiar with the Alliance website, and I'm also very familiar with its limitations. Luann, they haven't rolled out the new catalog yet, have they? I'm a little out of touch on that.
Yes, the new catalog went into effect on the 1st.
Oh, it did. Okay. All right. I was going to talk to the old catalog. So, Luann, any advice on navigating the new one?
Patience.
Okay. All right. So, anyway.
I will go in and look and see if they are advertised in the new catalog and list them in the chat.
Yes. Anyway, thank you, Rodney, for that question. We went from a not super user-friendly website to this new edition that rolled out over the summer, which was supposed to be a little bit more user-friendly and easier to locate things. According to Luann, there might still be a few bugs to work out there. So we'll see if we can get you maybe a direct link to some of those TBRI courses. Megan's saying kids feeling overwhelmed, not able to process words or directions when in sensory overload. Boy, that's beautifully said. Thank you for that. And Rodney's talking about the calendar or the catalog and viewing things in a particular order. I think those pieces will be coming. Yeah, I'll even though if they're not quite implemented yet. Astrid's mentioning sensory challenges in kids might look like meltdowns, crying on the floor, yelling, climbing without fear or harm of self, shutting down, sleeping in a loud environment. Absolutely. Aversion to stimulus or stimuli. Absolutely. A question about epigenetics as well. Yep, all of these can feed into kids with sensory processing challenges. Oh, and please define trauma in this context. What a great question, right? For our conversation tonight, we're going to be talking about trauma from the lens, when we, just in a general sense, when we talk about trauma in a child welfare context, we're oftentimes speaking of abuse or neglect, and there's a lot of different forms that can take. Tonight, we're specifically going to talk about when trauma, when abuse or neglect happens in that critical stage, when a child's attachment cycle is developing. So, and to go a little bit further, when we're talking about trauma, really what we're talking about is incidents, situations, events that interfere with a child being able to develop their cognitive processing in kind of a healthy and normal way. If a child is experiencing stress, fear, or threat, particularly repeatedly, it's going to impact how that brain develops. It's going to drive the strength of their development into the fear centers of their brain, and the thinking, reasoning parts of their brain will be underdeveloped. And when we talk about trauma impacting the developing brain, that's really what we mean. Kids that have come from environments of stress, threat, and fear are going to have really super strong fear responses, stress responses. Fight, flight, and freeze are kind of what we traditionally think of when we think of those. They've expanded from there, but that's to keep it simple. And that's absolutely appropriate. Kids need, in those environments, they need those protective skills to kick in. That's how our kids survive. The cost to that is when you're spending so much time in the survival parts of your brain, right? The fear centers of your brain, you just don't have the energy and opportunity to be developing those upper parts of your brain that handle thinking, reasoning, problem solving, regulating emotions, all of those things. So anyway, short but long definition of trauma. Melody's saying sensory seeker, needing to stand, wiggle, spin all the time, dragging hands along walls when walking. Yes, yes, and yes. To that, thank you for recognizing that that can be a sensory need and response. Certain types of fabrics, touch, hands-on tactile activities like Play-Doh, dirt, sand, seeking out water, floating, and the sound of ears underwater, jumping, wanting pressure on their bodies. All right, so you could teach this class. And needing crunchy snacks, all of those sorts of things. Beautifully said, beautifully said. All right, so sensory integration. We've got a little bit of an idea of what it might look like. Thank you all for sharing kind of your thoughts and ideas around that. But I'm going to break down really quickly this term, sensory integration. If I can turn the page here, just so we can all kind of be on the same page with that. Senses, words we hear all the time, we use them all the time, and I think most of us are pretty aware of kind of the big five, right? Sight, smell, taste, hearing, they're on. When we talk about senses, that's usually what pops to mind. Sometimes people refer to these as the kindergarten senses, like the things you've learned about when you were in kindergarten. Another term that you might also hear for the big five senses is your external senses. So information that's happening outside of your body, and you are taking that in and processing it. Lesser known, however, is this other category of senses that is sometimes referred to as the internal senses. And those are what you see on I've got this yellow box on the screen. I hope y'all can see it. You know, if you're doing this class on your phone, I know it's going to be a little teeny. Anyway, but there's three senses listed below that kind of fall in this category of what we call internal senses. And those are vestibular, proprioception, and interoception. And if you haven't heard these words and aren't familiar with these, don't feel bad. This is something that we don't talk about a whole lot, but it certainly is important in how it impacts our kids and how they navigate the world. So just to give you, I'm not going to talk about the kindergarten senses, the big five, because I think we all kind of probably have a pretty good beat on that. How those can be derailed is a little bit of a later conversation. So we'll go into how those could be impacted. We'll kind of keep going on. And then but I wanted to talk briefly about the internal senses, just to give you a little base understanding as we can kind of, so we can, as we go on, we can look at these senses kind of as a whole. And somebody's saying, do you have the ability to focus the slide a little bit better? I'm sorry to say I do not, and I apologize for its quality not being as clear. So I'm not sure what's up with that, if it's the video feed on the device I'm using, or if I just picked fuzzy images for the slide. We'll see as we go on. Vestibular, right? This has to do with our sense of balance, and it's regulated within the inner ear. This develops in infancy, right? Everything develops in infancy. That's where the foundation is laid. So, you know, I'll probably say that over and over, and I apologize if it sounds repetitive. But when you think about it, when you're caring for an infant, you are picking that baby up, doing whatever needed, you're setting that baby down, you pick that baby up, you set that baby down, you might rock that baby, you might bounce that baby. All of that is activating that inner ear. And through the support that that child is receiving from the caregiver in those moments, they're learning how to understand those sensations and develop their sense of balance. This happens organically. We don't even think about it in normal, healthy infant care. But one of the things that we see, and we see it not entirely unfrequently in kids that we interact with in a child welfare situation, is kids that didn't have that type of loving, nurturing, caring, you know, care when they were infants. So think about that baby that was maybe left in their crib, right? And not picked up and not held and not bounced. Kids that were strapped into a car seat, right? They were safe, but they also weren't getting the movement necessary to start developing this part of their vestibular senses. So when we talk about vestibular, think balance and how it was kind of developed in those early stages. Proprioception, big word, right? Proprioception, if this is a term you're not familiar with, really just means knowing where your body is in space. And again, this is something that starts developing in infancy and continues to develop with the support of a caregiver. Think about that newborn baby if you've had a chance to interact with one. Super, super newborn, you know, days, weeks old. That baby really can't do much and control much with their body. But if you put your hand in their hand, oftentimes that baby's gonna like grab your finger and hold on to it. That is a child trying to ground themselves, right? It's instinctual too, right? But it's a child trying to ground themselves to make sense of kind of where they are in this big, scary new space of the world that they've been kind of launched into, right? Our ability to write on a piece of paper, applying the appropriate amount of pressure, can relate back to our sense of proprioception, right? To be able to pick up a cup without spilling that beverage all over yourself, knowing how much force and needed to do that can drive back to our sense of proprioception. How to use your body in the space that's around you. Again, this starts early on, the ability to navigate this in those early infant stages of development. Oh, and somebody's saying, please spell. I'm gonna just cut and paste it and put it in the chat box. Thank you, I should have thought to do that. Anyway, so think about those kids. Some of you mentioned in like, what do sensory challenges look like with kids? Some of you mentioned it, right? Kids that are too rough, kids that have to touch everything, right? Those can be kids that are underdeveloped in this area and are using things to help them feel grounded, to know where they are. I don't know about you, but I have had kids, and sometimes we label these kids as clumsy, just kind of that touchy-feely kid that just has to like have hands on everything. It can be in big and little ways. I had kids that used to like walk into walls and fall down stairs. I had one that used to swing really high on her swing set and then let go and fall backwards, because she was using that to ground her. She was doing it for a few different reasons, but using it to kind of figure out where she was in space, right? She also would walk into walls and fall downstairs and drag her head along when she was riding her bike, and her little helmet would be along the big wheel. She obviously had a lot of sensory challenges, that little one, but this was an underdeveloped sense of proprioception, and she was doing what she could in a really unskilled way to kind of figure out, how do I navigate this world, right? And then the last one, without going into too much depth on any of these, is interoception. And this is the ability to perceive and interpret what internal feelings, like hunger, thirst, cold, I need to use the bathroom, I'm tired and I need to sleep, kind of those body cues that we think of are sort of instinctually understood. Kids that have struggles in the area of interoception have struggle recognizing those communications that their body is giving them, right? They don't notice them. They oftentimes can't name them. Or if they can, they can't connect it inside themselves to that feeling or sensation. And again, when we think about infant development, a child is learning what those feelings are. They're learning how to process them, and they're learning how to meet those needs, all with the support of a caregiver alongside of them. So baby's cold, baby's hungry, baby's scared, right? They cry, caregiver comes, and caregiver is going to provide that reassurance, and caregiver is going to meet the need. And so that child is going to start to connect with things like, hey, when I feel cold, somebody wrapped me in a blanket, somebody put me in a fuzzy or warmer jammy, somebody did something to meet that need, right? So they're connecting that feeling with kind of an appropriate response to meet that need. Again, happens without us thinking about it when healthy infant care is taking place. In environments of neglect where we don't have that kind of available, nurturing, in tune caregiver, there's no one to guide that child through feeling those sensations. So kids kind of can get hung up in their own thinking and processing, to the point that sometimes they just learn to dismiss those feelings altogether. So anyway, don't want to spend too much time on that, but wanted to break down when we're talking about internal senses, like what in the heck is that? Those are the big three. There's some others, but those are the main ones that are talked about. So we're going to take all of that, and then we're going to integrate it, right? We're taking in all of this sensory information. It's flooding our body and brain, and our body and brain needs to know what to do with that. So that's where this term comes from, right? So the process that the brain receives, it organizes and interprets all of that sensory information. And so that is kind of what we're here to talk about tonight. Just to confuse you and bore you further, I'm going to throw one more definition at you, but I promise we'll be quick with this one. There it is. Sensory processing. The title of our class tonight is, right, sensory integration troubleshooting. But oftentimes we hear this other term that is sometimes referred to as sensory processing. Are they the same? Are they different? Do they work together? I just wanted to give a little information about that. Not that it's really a big deal. Let me just start by saying you're going to see these two terms used pretty interchangeably. They are slightly different, but I don't know so much that it matters. So like if somebody says sensory processing when it's really sensory integration, the world isn't going to like, have issue with that. Just because we do hear these two terms, I just wanted you to kind of know the breakdown of the two, right? It starts with sensory processing. So all of that sensory information we're taking in both in the world outside of us and then also those internal senses, our brain has to do something with that. So kind of that initial hub of information is what we call sensory processing. Sensory integration is going to take all that information that we just processed in a kind of a simplistic way, and then it's going to adapt it to a little bit higher level of processing. How do we take that information? How do we interpret it? How do we translate that into behavior? That's kind of where sensory integration comes in, right? Sensory processing is the foundation for sensory integration. So they're so closely kind of married and tied together that it's hard to kind of parse them apart. Yeah, I think that's probably all I'll say about that because I don't want us to get, too bored with all of this stuff. As I go along tonight, I will probably use the word sensory processing and the word sensory integration sort of interchangeably, again, because they are so closely linked. If a child has struggled with sensory navigating their senses to the point that it rises to the space of needing a diagnosis, the diagnosis you're most commonly going to see is what we call SPD, or sensory processing disorder. So again, do they really mean sensory integration disorder? Probably, but sensory processing disorder is what oftentimes you'll hear. So, okay. Why are we spending time talking about this? Throwing all these definitions and ideas at you. The reason that the CARES program, this conversation is taking place with you all, right, that are interacting with kids in this child welfare environment most likely, is because children that are struggling with sensory integration or sensory processing is very, very common in, again, a child welfare world. The statistic that I have here on the screen, maybe you've heard it before. If you've taken other Alliance classes, we throw this around a lot. If not, if this is your first introduction to it, this is why we're pausing to have conversations around sensory integration and sensory processing, because the likelihood of you providing care in whatever context that you interact with kids in our system is very, very high. For any of you that are kind of like, into the research and the data, I did just want to say, even though this is a statistic that is quoted frequently, that 80% of children in foster care experience some degree of sensory processing challenges or sensory integration challenges. That information isn't derived from like any one particular study. I feel like sometimes we don't do a great job of this in child welfare. We kind of throw out data and statistics, but we don't really source where they go back to. I just really want you to know that I didn't just make these things up, or I'm just not talking out of my own experience entirely. But even though this statistic isn't necessarily tied to one particular like peer-reviewed type of study, there is a lot of research out there that speaks to the high prevalence of kids in foster care type settings, out of home placement type settings, experiencing sensory integration and processing issues. Just to throw a couple at you, you don't have to write these down. I just want you to know that there's data and research behind it. The American Journal of Occupational Therapy published a study in 2023. It was specifically around kids in congregate foster care, more like group care type settings, where their findings were even higher. 88 to 92% of those kids were experiencing sensory processing and integration problems. PubMed also did a study in 2024, and these were kids ages 8 to 17, I believe. Also, again, talking about that elevated level of sensory processing challenges amongst kids in foster care. So there's lots of studies that drive to this. And I think when this is quoted, what different articles and different speakers and different individual researchers have done have kind of taken that all, lumped it together and pulled out kind of their best aggregate guess. So that's what I'll say on that. The moral of the story, again, is if you're working with kids that are in foster care and out of home placement, it's very likely 80% up that a child could be experiencing challenges in this area. So that's why Luann scheduled this conversation, because we know this is something people are going to interact with. Why, though, right? So why do our kids in this setting experience this to such a larger degree than what you might see like in the general population? It's an important question to ask. I've already alluded to it, but I just wanted to step back to that for just a second to kind of give us that grounding as we move forward. The foundation, as I keep saying, for healthy processing of senses, right, and all that information is formed through a healthy attachment cycle. So when I was talking about those internal senses and I was talking about the type of care caregivers provide, that's what we're talking about, a healthy attachment cycle and process. And for any of you that have taken any kind of training related to our Washington State foster care system, you have probably been introduced to the attachment cycle. If this is new information for you, welcome. Glad you're here getting your toe wet in it, because this is like the place to start when trying to understand kind of what's going on with the kids that we serve and how do we need to tailor our responses in light of that. So very briefly, all of our kids experience needs, right? And when that child has a need, they send a signal. Usually it's a cry, right? So we're talking about infant development at this point. In a perfect world, when that baby cries, that caregiver is going to show up. They're going to show up in a loving and nurturing way, and they're going to meet that need in an appropriate fashion. If baby's hungry, they're going to feed baby. They're going to cuddle baby, sing to baby. They'll do all the lovey, ooey gooey stuff at the same time. But they're meeting that need in a safe and connected way. If baby's wet, they're going to change the diaper. If baby's scared, they're going to pick it up and reassure that baby. Like, you know, fill in the blank. Caregiver meets the need in a loving way. And as a result of that, a couple things are happening, right? That child is learning that, you know, the world is kind of uncomfortable because it doesn't feel good to be hungry. It doesn't feel good to be wet. It doesn't feel good to be scared. But somebody is going to come along and help me through it. And through what that caregiver does in that act of care, that child is learning how those needs can be appropriately met, and that you really don't have to be scared of them, that being uncomfortable doesn't have to be life-threatening and overwhelming, that care and support is coming. And so that trust develops, right? When this is happening, right? In infant development. It's happening not once in a while. We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds of times a day. This cycle is being reinforced. That caregiver responds, meets the need, and all those things that I just described are happening. The flip side of that is also true. If a child is not in a healthy caregiving relationship, right, their caregivers are not showing up, meeting those needs, not providing the nurturing care, then the opposite happens. That child is taking in all of this information. Much of it is going to be sensory, right? And they're not going to have that support. Being uncomfortable is going to be life-threatening, right? Or super, super scary at that point, because infants are 100% dependent on the care that is provided to them. They can do nothing, literally nothing for themselves as an infant. It's also going to impede the development of trust, right? The world's a scary place and you can't count on people to help you. Those are the messages that are received during an unhealthy attachment cycle. And so when a child doesn't have that support, pairing uncomfortable sensory information with a supported caregiver, meeting that need and kind of teaching that kid how to cope with it and how to get through it, that child is going to have deficits in that area. And that's a lot of where we're going to see some of our sensory processing challenges or our sensory integration challenges spring out of. Really, what we're talking about is the ability to regulate. Regulation is another one of those words we love to throw around a lot. And there's lots of great definitions for regulation. We hear it in different forms, all different ways. This kid's got great self-regulation skills. We love those kids, right? We love all kids, but kids with great self-regulation skills, for most of us as caregivers, if they call you up and say, hey, I've got this kid that needs placement, this kid's got great self-regulation skills, we're going to be like, yes, please bring that child to my house, right? Or that kid in your classroom, or that kid on your soccer team. It doesn't matter where. Kids with good self-regulation skills, we like those. We also like good adults with good self-regulation skills, because a dysregulated adult can be a very scary thing, right? A very uncomfortable thing to be a part of. Regulation, oftentimes when people think about being regulated, they equate it to being calm. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that definition. I think we could expand on it a little bit, because for most of us, you might be able to think of times where maybe you weren't entirely calm, but you were still regulated. And regulation oftentimes is one kind of helpful way maybe to think about it, is like in spite of what's going on around you or within you, you can still access your thinking brain. You've kind of got those things in balance, right? Yeah, there's kind of craziness happening here, but I can still think. I'm not so overwhelmed that the thinking of my brain is shut down. So we kind of think oftentimes regulation equals balance equals being able to make good, thoughtful, decisions and problem solve. This is also a process, right, that develops over time with the support of a caregiver. And you can see at the very bottom of this screen, I kind of sketched out super briefly what that process of developing regulation looks like. With infants in the beginning, they can't regulate themselves. They don't have the ability to. Their little nervous systems haven't been developed to the point that they can do that. They need someone to do regulation for them. And that's where the caregiver comes in, and that's what we call external regulation. That child is looking to that caregiver to kind of guide them through every situation and meet every need. And that's how it starts, right? External regulation, caregiver does all the regulating for the child. But over time, right, as that child has experienced things, as they've learned some skills from their caregiver of how to cope or how to meet some of those needs on their own, that child isn't going to be 100% reliant on that caregiver. They're going to be able to do some of it themselves. And that's what we call co-regulation. So a lot of times that baby's going to be able to, keep themselves balanced whatever might be going on. And we're thinking, you know, could be really any context, but we're really thinking in a sensory kind of environment right now. Whatever's going on outside or inside this kid, sometimes this baby's going to be able to regulate themselves because an adult has shown them how to, right? And provided support, and they know they can trust, hey, if this gets to be too much for me, I know my caregiver is going to show up. And that's essentially what co-regulation is. Babies doing some of the balancing and regulation on their own, but when needed, that caregiver is still there and still provides what is missing, right? What that child isn't able to do on their own. Co-regulation is the next step. And then progressing from there, we move on to self-regulation. And that's where that child has kind of the foundational wiring and knowledge to know how to maintain that sense of balance in stressful situations. Is it going to be perfect? No, we don't know even one probably perfectly self-regulated kid. I don't know that I, as an adult, can say I'm perfectly self-regulated all the time, right? There's going to be frequent times we're going to need to bounce back to co-regulation. But the foundation, like the wiring, right, has been laid. So we think about this development process of attachment and within it, regulation, taking place in that first kind of infancy to 3-ish. You can stretch it farther than that. But when the attachment cycle isn't being met in an optimal way, this is an area that's going to be greatly impacted. So when you have that kid that just really falls apart over every little thing, kind of spikes behaviorally over really, really small things, and you're like, where the heck did that come from, right? Oftentimes, again, there's always other reasons that could be flowing into this, but oftentimes one of the things that we'll see is that child just has not learned how to self-regulate. That developmental process didn't take place for them. And so there's some gaps, there's some delays in that. So this very much shows up in sensory processing and integration as well, right? If nobody taught you how to handle this kind of like onslaught of sensory information we're experiencing all day long, we're going to have poor ability to regulate or remain balanced, stay in our thinking brain when those experiences are going on around us. So anyway, okay. Question in the chat says, what are the tips and tools to help children with sensory integration issues, such as giving a child who has sensory integrations around loud noises, headphones? Exactly. And we are going to pivot to kind of the what to do part in just a second, because I know that's really why people come to these, right? I think for us to be effective in the strategies and interventions that we're going to use with the kids that we work with, we need to have some foundational knowledge about what's going on and why are they acting this way. But really, you know, the golden nuggets that everybody is looking for is what can we do? And I've got some resources to point you to and some ideas to share with you. So we will be getting there, I promise it. When a child is struggling with sensory integration, sensory processing, what we're seeing is just this reduced capacity to process all of that information. And one way to think about this that's often used in our sensory integration world is what we call understanding what that idea around a window of tolerance might be. And it's pretty self-explanatory in some ways, but there's a gentleman named Dr. Dan Siegel, who, again, if you've been hanging out taking caregiver courses, you've probably heard and seen Dr. Dan Siegel quite a bit. He talks about understanding the fear and stress parts of the brain and how it impacts a child's thinking and behavior through using a model of your hand. We call it the brain in the palm of the hand. So if you've ever heard of that, that comes from Dr. Dan Siegel. He wrote a book called The Whole Brain Child. Great information in there. He has a new book that's been out in the last year or two called Brainstorm. The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Mind is the subtitle to Brainstorm. I have not read that one yet. It's on my to-do list and downloaded on my Kindle, but I haven't done it. I'm excited because Dan Siegel's work is all great. But he came up with this idea of a window of tolerance. And really what we mean is it's that mental state where we feel like we're in control, we're open-minded, we're kind of emotionally steady, and we're able to deal with challenges without being overwhelmed. And the long story short is kids that had an improper and unhealthy attachment process for some reason, usually abuse, neglect in our situation, but there can be other reasons as well, are going to have this little teeny window of tolerance. That's what this little slide is trying to point us to. Our hope, right, is that we can guide our children into developing a larger window of tolerance for the sensory information that they're receiving. So really, at the end of the day, that's kind of the goal. And when we're talking about how do you help a kid with sensory processing issues or challenges, really what we're talking about is how can we and what can we do to increase that child's window of tolerance? The good news is there are lots of things that we can do. There is a ton of research about this. We owe a lot of this to the autism community. It's not uncommon for people on the autism spectrum to be very sensitive to sensory information. So as we've worked with and learned and developed strategies within the autism community, really a lot of those we're finding work really well with anybody struggling with sensory challenges, even if you're not like somewhere on the autism spectrum. And for our conversation today, we're going to look at all of those strategies that we could use, all of those interventions in kind of this TBRI lens. How can I, as I'm supporting my child to develop these missing skills, right, around how to process what's going on with them through the sensory information they're receiving, how can we do this in a connected way? How can we build trust and relationship while we're helping this child develop kind of that sensory tolerance? What's going on inside that child's body, what's going on inside that child's environment, how do we use that to help them remain balanced and expand their window of tolerance? And then even while we're correcting, if we have to teach or intervene in behavior, how do we do that in such ways that takes into consideration that child's sensory tolerance as well? So all of these things kind of piggyback on our TBRI principles. And I just wanted to kind of point that out. And that's what we'll be looking at here. Okay, where do we start? Right? Okay, I know my kids got some sensory challenges. You've talked about that enough. Now what do I do with it? A good starting place, not the only starting place, but just one thing to throw out there is to start by kind of just observing your child and these responses and see if you can kind of sort out a little bit which direction they're heading. And somebody mentioned sensory seeking earlier. So thank you so much for kind of kicking our thoughts into that direction. We'll talk about these two categories here in just a second. And you can see on the slide, hopefully, if it's not too blurry, what some of these sensory craving or sensory seeking behaviors might look like, or what some of these sensory avoidant, you can also hear this called sensory defensive behaviors might look like. These are just some of them, right? Just to kind of whet your appetite, give you an idea of what it might look like and how it might fall. But for us, really a great place to start is like, okay, what kind of things does my child seek out from? What kind of experiences are they kind of driven to? What do they kind of shy away or pull back from? Are there times where I look at my kid and I think, okay, this kid needs some calming? Are there times when I look at my kid and I think, okay, this kid needs like alerting. They need to up their level of energy. These are kind of the beginning blocks, right, of building our intervention, like what we're going to do to support this child in an appropriate way, around developing better sensory tolerance and understanding. So sensory craving, sensory seeking is probably fairly self-explanatory, right? I kind of just mentioned it, kids seeking out sensory experiences. One thing to keep in mind, though, is when our kids are doing this, this is their attempt to self-regulate, right? It can look like anything but regulation if we're thinking regulation equals calm, but that child is trying to process the world in such a way to bring balance. They might be doing it in wholly inappropriate and ineffective ways, right? It might be their very unskilled attempts, but that's what they're going for. And like you can see, like somebody mentioned, like jumping off of high things, tackling, crashing into walls. All of those can be considered sensory craving or sensory seeking. And if you have this child in your home or in your care or in your practice, wherever direction you interact with youth and kids, even if you don't know these terms, sensory craving or sensory seeking, you probably know it, right? I mean, you probably feel it deep in your soul. This is what's going on with this kid. Caregivers of sensory seeking, sensory craving kids are oftentimes tired. They're exhausted. The level of supervision for our sensory craving kids can be very, very high, right? To match a child's energy can be a big out. Yes, Dennis. Yeah, I was like, I usually get some amens when we talk about this part, because it takes a lot for this child to meet their sensory needs, right? And they're doing it oftentimes in very physical ways, not entirely, but it can also tip over into the unsafe very quickly. So your level of supervision, your level of involvement, your level of redirection, intervention, whatever word you want to use, is going to be elevated when you have this kid, because it's just survival. That's what we have to do as we're teaching this child their sensory processing regulation skills. The flip side of this is that sensory avoidant or defensive child, right? And again, hopefully you can see on the slide a little bit of what some of those examples are, right? But that kid that's like putting his hands over his ears, that's a child that's auditory sense is being overstimulated, and the child doesn't have the ability to process or regulate that. One thing that makes all of this even more fun is that your child can be both, right? A child can be both. They can be both sensory craving, sensory seeking in certain ways, in certain areas, and they can be sensory avoidant or defensive in others. So it would be nice, in a sense, if kids fell into one neat category, but they don't, because nothing with our kids falls into neat categories, in my opinion. It's always multifaceted and many layered. So if you're thinking like, this kid's all over the page, it's likely, right? Because again, they didn't have that support needed in those early stages to know how to respond to the sensory kind of stimulation and information that they're being given. So they've adapted in different ways and have different sensitivities and needs in certain areas. So anyway, okay, so that's a good place to start. Where does my child fall and in what situations, and try to start kind of like delineating some of that out. Wanted to share with you in the time that we have here together. I know I can't like answer every question about sensory integration. I can't provide everything everybody's going to need. So I wanted to drive you to some resources that can, at least can do a much more robust job than our little time that we have together allows today. And also things you can refer back to later, right? You know, when you're not in the space with somebody talking at you. So one book, Astrid just put in a brilliant example. I don't know if y'all are able to see the chat, so I'm just gonna throw some of these out there as I see them. But like, she says, they have a kiddo who won't eat wet food, right? But loves the pool. That's so interesting, right? Water provides a lot of proprioception, right? Where you are in space, proprioception oftentimes is the need being met there is through like deep touch, deep tissue touch, and water provides that pressure. That's fascinating to me that you see these two things side by side. I love that example. Yes, that's how kind of confusing and conflated our kids' responses could be. And to help us understand that and to give us some tools, what do we do then? I wanted to point you, like I said, to some resources. The first I wanted to mention is this book that you kind of can see on the slide. It looks like the top of it's cut off a little bit, but its official name is The Connected Therapist. Please don't let the name scare you. The subtitle to it is Relating Through the Senses. And that's really what to focus on with this book is how do we heal this child's improperly developed nervous system that does not allow them to effectively process sensory information? How do I do this through connection and through relationship? That's what this book is about. You can see the author's name there. It's Marty Smith. She is an occupational therapy, which is the, I don't know, the body of medical supports. I don't know if that's the right word for it. The therapy that you use when you're struggling with sensory integration. A child with sensory processing disorder will work under the care of an occupational therapist. It's not physical therapy, it's not speech therapy, you know, there's all these other therapies. Occupational therapy is what deals with sensory processing or integration problems. So Marty Smith is an occupational therapist. She also is a TBRI practitioner, and she has worked very closely with other branches of neuroscience to kind of apply occupational therapy to what we know about brain development, and its interruptions due to trauma. So, if you're looking for a helpful read, this is a book I recommend. It's divided into a couple sections, like it's talking about, you know, why is connection so important when helping kids develop sensory processing skills. It talks about the 8 senses that I mentioned briefly in much more detail and understanding, and with ideas if your kid is struggling in this area, here's some lists of things you might try. Right, all of that is in her book in that section. And then the last whole chunk of the book is just called Practical Strategies and Supports, and she's got a couple chapters around that. So if you're looking for like, when my kid does this, here's some ideas of what to do, this book is a great start. So wanted to throw that out there. And when we're thinking about ourselves as the person interacting with this kid, I'm not an occupational therapist. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that right in the beginning. I do not hold that credential. I'm just a caregiver, right? But as we saw, as I keep talking and talking and talking about the attachment cycle, right? How does the ability to self-regulate around anything, but in our context, sensory integration, how does it develop? It develops with the support of a caregiver. And that's what it's going to need to learn those skills, those missing skills, and heal that part of the brain that wasn't developed properly. So as caregivers, even though we're not occupational therapists, there is all kinds of things that we can do. But a lot of it is going to be, in essence, we're going to go back and we're going to recreate that attachment cycle, providing those necessary supports, but it's going to look different, right? Because your kid is probably older. Some of you might be caring for infants, but a lot of us, you've got a 6-year-old, you've got an 11-year-old, you've got a 19-year-old in your home, and they're still struggling. How can I go back and recreate the attachment cycle? That's what Marty Smith's book and some of the other resources that I'm going to share with you are designed to kind of help you think through. But basically, we just have to be willing to get a little creative. We got to think outside the box. Like, how can I meet this need, but do it in kind of a respectful and age-appropriate way? Also, because many of us here are licensed caregivers or caring for kids within this child welfare environment in Washington State, anything we do, we need to use good judgment. We need to follow the WACs related to how we interact with kids and child safety. But aside from that, there's a ton of creativity that we can allow ourselves in this time and space. So I put on the slide Marty Smith's kind of her personal mantra in both her caregiving as a parent, but also in her professional practice as an occupational therapist, is when you're looking at this child that's struggling with a sensory need in some way, just to ask yourself, what could we do here? And as ideas flood to your mind, if it can't hurt and it might help, give it a try. There is definitely an element of trial and error that takes place here. But sometimes we might, as caregivers, shy away from things because it might seem too silly. It might seem babyish. It might seem kind of odd. But if you're willing to like take it out for that test drive, kind of kick the tires of this and see how it works with this kid, sometimes we can find that breakthrough that we're looking for, or the start of that breakthrough. So just one example for this that I was going to share briefly. I had a kiddo placed with me. It was quite a few years ago now. And he was pretty young. He was 2-ish, right? And this kid was really struggling around eating. Came from a very neglected environment where he wasn't really, he wasn't malnourished, but he wasn't exposed to a lot of different foods. And basically he was just given like a bottle of milk and would just drink milk all the time, without a whole lot of solid foods, even at 2-ish years old. So he comes to my house, kid loves milk, would drink milk all day long, and be absolutely fine with that. But knowing we need to start introducing more foods was running into a ton of resistance with this kid. So thinking about, okay, what could we do? What might help? It's probably not going to hurt. So let's try some things. So I tried having like music playing while we were eating. I tried having really calm environments while we're eating. I tried making sure I was there present next to him. As he was eating, he was a really social kid. I thought maybe we really need that connection piece. That wasn't working real well. I thought, okay, maybe that relationship is too distracting, right? And he needs a little bit more quiet and space to himself to eat. We tried that where I kind of, stayed in the background, but wasn't as like face-to-face present. None of these things was working, right? Again, trying all these things to see. One time we were having a party at our house. My sister was sitting next to little one. Little one had all this food kind of on his tray, all cut up, trying to get him to eat. He wasn't having it. He wasn't having it. And my sister rolled up a piece of, I had little pieces of sandwich meat, caught up so he couldn't choke on it, but rolled it up, put it on his little 2-year-old fork and handed it to him. And he just put it in his mouth and ate it. And then she did it again and he ate it, and did it again and he ate it, and did it again. And the kid ate solid food, a protein source, no less, right? And we were all like, okay, something just happened here, right? Something around this kiddo was he didn't want to touch the food, but he didn't mind it in his mouth. He didn't want to touch it with his fingers, and he wasn't skilled enough really yet to use a spoon or a little baby fork very well. But so you just think, well, finger food, that's just what we do. This kid hated feeding himself with his hands, hated it, right? But if somebody would help him, guide him through putting the food on his utensil and eating it, he did much better. And that was like the breakthrough moment we had with that kid. So again, if it can't hurt, it might help. Give it a try. So another thing I want to point out to you, and I'm watching our time, I know it, and I want us to have a chance to get to some questions, but I had some very specific resources I wanted to make sure I had a chance to share with you, is something called the Calmer assessment. So again, this same occupational therapist that wrote the book that I just mentioned has developed an on-demand, free, I'm putting it in the chat box if anybody wants to follow the link, online assessment that you can do on behalf of the child that is in your care that can help you break down by answering a few questions like, where is this child struggling? And spit out a list of, hey, here's some things that you can do. Again, this is developed by Marty Smith, an occupational therapist, using the neurosequential model developed by Dr. Bruce Perry, if any of these names mean to you anything to you, and develop this algorithm to kind of help sort this out and give us a starting place. So I thought I'm gonna flip my screens here for just a moment. Just wanted you to see really quickly what this can look like. We're not going to do this assessment. It's short. It just takes a couple minutes. But wanted you to see kind of what it looks like. So let me resize a few things here and show you what I'm talking about. So if you follow that link that I put in the chat box, this will take you to the Calmer assessment. Again, it's spelled with a K, but it's pronounced Calmer. She used a hybrid of people's names that helped her develop this, and this is what I came up with. Anyway, so if you just click on this button, it tells you a little bit about how this was developed, but if you click on this button, it's going to pop you right over to some assessment questions. And this is the same thing that I had on the slide, but this is the live version of it. You can name it, right? Whatever this child's name is. And then you also get an opportunity to kind of sort it out by age. And then over here, they're going to break down, and I don't know if this is meaningful to you, I just think it's interesting, the different parts of the brain that are affected and ask you some questions about that. So you can actually see where your child might be struggling and which parts of their brain are kind of where some of the issues lie. So some of the questions they're asking are like things, oops, I think I moved things a little bit. Does this child have difficulty with food? Is question 4 right there. You can say this, no concern, mild concern, moderate, or severe. You do that going down the list. And again, it's just this one little online page here. 16 questions. Yes, I wanted to say it was 16 questions. And answer these questions. This is, again, as a caregiver, your own informal assessment of this child, and then click on Generate Report. It's going to give you 2 options. There is something called the short report, and there is a long report. So again, super briefly, I can expand this a little bit. I did a sample one just to have on hand for you to see what this assessment looks like. But it takes the areas that were the questions that were just asked, shows kind of how you rated them. This over here on the right is the area of the brain that is affected. And then as you scroll down, it's going to give you kind of a little synopsis. It says this report indicates several brainstem concerns. And then it's going to define that a little bit. This report indicates several dicephalon concerns. right? As well as other parts of the brain. So it's going to define that for you a little bit. And then this down here is what I wanted to show you. It's going to break down things that you can do. Okay, my kid struggles in this area. This report has helped me kind of sort this out. What do I do, right? What do I do? This is going to give you a few ideas to get you started. And it's going to break these down into things you can do at home. If you follow these tabs across, things you can do at school, things you can do in nature, right? Outdoors. Outdoor tends to be very grounding and healing for kids' sensory systems. Not all, right? Some that's too overstimulating or uncomfortable. But ways that we can use that. And then also, if anybody's here working with group staff or group care in some ways, there's also a tab about things you can do with group care. So that's the short report. Wanted to show you the long report. Same information, same kid. Again, I mentioned you did the same assessment, but this is just going to be a little bit more detailed. So depending on how deep you want to go down with this is going to provide more information in each of these areas where your child kind of popped for having concerns. And then more detail as far as what these kind of intervention strategies, things to do might look like, right? And again, it's going to have these same tabs across. So I just wanted to point that out to you. We don't all have easy access to an occupational therapist to do a formal assessment. Does this child have sensory processing issues and challenges? And are we able, and then develop kind of a treatment plan for that child? We don't all have access to that. I wish. One of our child welfare trainers, who this is an area of deep passion for her, says if she was queen, every child in our child welfare system would get an occupational therapy assessment, just like a routine eye exam or anything else. Let's just see where they fall. If we know 80% of our kids are going to struggle with this, then let's assess them. Let's see if we can do, I don't know, an earlier kind of intervention in this area. Until that happens, this is helping you build kind of your own treatment plan for what you can do for the kids that you might be interacting with. So wanted to throw that out there. And I see a couple questions in the chat that I kind of disappeared. Is it spelled concern because of the name of the creator? I think they called it Calmer. So just to be cheesy, they did concern with a K. I know I've always thought that was kind of weird too. And Luann's mentioning she'll share these resources in the follow-up email. One other thing I want to mention is, again, another person to have in mind, like who are the people that work with kids with trauma that really get it and can communicate it well. That's kind of what I'm trying to point you to a little bit here. Dan Siegel, Bruce Perry, Marty Smith. There's many of them. Another one I'd love you to be at least a little bit familiar with is a woman named Robin Goebel. She wrote a book called, I don't know if you can see it, Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors. That's just one thing she has done. She has a huge body of work. She is a child psychologist. She's a licensed mental health therapist. She's a TBRI practitioner and educator. And she is also great at taking complicated concepts like, you know, the neurobiology of trauma, and kind of speaking it into a level that's easy to understand. And one of the things that she is super great about and super generous about is just sharing free resources. you can buy the books, you can do all the things, but her website, and I'm going to put this out here as well, has a bunch of just free kind of info sheets and on all different topics related to basically caring for children who've experienced trauma. And I just wanted you to know there is one of them that is related to kids with sensory integration challenges. I think it's 5 pages in all. I just gave you a little snapshot of what they kind of look like. But really, it's taken some of the information I've shared today, broken it down in a very easy to read visual sort of way, and just gives you ideas too, right? Okay, you've got a kid that maybe is struggling in the area of proprioception. What do I do? It's got some ideas around specific things that you can try. So Robin Goebel, another great name for you. Her podcast is Chef Kiss phenomenal. Again, she's super easy to listen to. She's super easy to understand. Every time I listen to her podcast, it kind of just blows my hair back. I learned something, I'm encouraged, I'm inspired, and she just gets it. She just gets it. She's worked with kids a long time. So with that, I'm gonna move over here. Oh, what's the podcast name? Robin Go. Oh, I just lost it. It might be the Big Baffling Behavior Show. If you go to this link that I put in there, it's going to take you to her free resources tab, but she also has a tab for her podcast. And her podcast, I should say, searches beautifully. Not all podcasts do, but if you're like, I want to learn more about sleep issues, you can type that in and the podcast will pop up that would relate to that. So anyway, thank you, Luann, being my wingman in the chat box and with the links. Love that. When we talk about expanding our child's window of tolerance, as I've mentioned, what we want to do is allow that child to experience the sensory environment that they're struggling with, but in a caring and supportive way so that they don't become overwhelmed or scared, right? We're going to go back and redo that process. I've been pointing you to places where you can go to be like, okay, what do I do for this, right? This thing, I want to know, what do I do for this thing? So I wanted to give you some ideas about how you can go out and kind of gather some ideas for yourself. And then also it'll probably springboard your thinking into how you're going to play that out in your own home. But it can oftentimes feel overwhelming, right? Like, I don't have time. I've got this sensory craving kid that has got me absolutely exhausted. I don't have time to do a bunch of like sensory work with this kid that I'm caring for. And you're right, you probably don't. But one of the things that I think is really helpful about working with kids around their sensory challenges is that it doesn't have to be big dedicated chunks of time. It doesn't have to be in a therapist's office. And really one of the things that I think most all of us find most helpful is really just thinking about like, what is my current schedule? And with these ideas now of possible sensory activities that I could do alongside this child, how can I just incorporate that already in our day, right? Are there things that I could incorporate into my bedtime routines, the after school routines, when we're driving in the car, whatever you have sitting at the table? I talked about, the thing with the little one and rolling up the food and putting it on the fork for him. How can I anchor my sensory activities I'm doing with this kid to things I already have going on? It might just need to be tweaked a little bit because it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It just takes a little bit of planning. And if we can use some of these tools I've just mentioned, take a look at our day, kind of crosswalk those two things together and integrate, hey, there's that word we've been talking about, mesh those together for ourselves, this can be doable. Ideally, we talk about kids needing some sort of sensory break, sensory activity about every 2-ish hours. Depends a little bit on the sense, right? Proprioception, about every 4 hours, vestibular, about every 6 hours. You don't have to remember that breakdown. I just think it's interesting because once you activate that inner ear, it lasts for a while. Once you've done some of this deep pressure type of work that we do to help ground kids in space, proprioceptive work, that usually, that they say, the experts, say that that can carry a kid usually about 4 hours, right? But a lot of the tactile stuff is shorter, 2 hours. So that's where that breakdown comes from. As we're doing any of it, I just wanted to kind of drive us back to this idea of connection, right? When sensory information is experienced, but it's not done in a supported relationship and connected way, we're going to first react in fear, right? So that infant that's never heard a door slam before, that infant's likely going to react in fear, right? That's going to be startling. That's going to be overly alerting. It's going to hurt their little auditory senses. All of those things are happening, right? But when that door slams and that caregiver is there being like, oh, wasn't that loud? That was scary, wasn't it? It's okay. It was just a door, right? And when that happens over and over and over again in the context of that nurturing relationship, we can move from that sense, right? That sensation, that information being scary to a place of safety because that child has experienced it within a safe relationship and knows how to handle it. So as you're working with your child to expand their window of tolerance around sensory information, at the heart of it is keeping that relationship and that connection right front and center. So with that, Luann, I think that's kind of all I have as far as kind of the talkie points of tonight. But anyway, if we want to stop the recording.